I just say that to introduce myself to you so that you have some context of where I'm at. With that being said, I want to give a brief overview of what we hope to accomplish this evening. This is a meeting of the Taconic and Green Board in the public, as all of our meetings are. We have carved out a question and answer section for the public following the question and answer section of the board to ensure the public has time to ask clarifying questions of both the superintendent and the architects. We know you have questions about the presentation that us board members may not think to ask. The goal is for the board to have the greatest possible understanding of the logistics and facts so that as a board we can narrow focus to 2 or 3 of the options presented, then make a recommendation to our superintendent. This is not the end of the discussion, rather just part of the process, focused on moving forward. Once we accomplish this, we will seek additional input from our taxpayers to inform our decisions making regarding next steps. And I just want to say that the board greatly appreciates the willingness of each of you in all of our towns to come together with us and examine our best options to ensure that we deliver an excellent education to all our students, regardless of the towns they reside. In the words of Deb Linus, one of the founding members of the Taconic and Green, all of our kids are all of our kids, and it is with that sentiment that we're here tonight for a path forward. At this point, I'm going to turn over to Randy Lowe, our superintendent.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. If I get soft, like too quiet, just let me know. So you're okay. I'm going to read off a script, which I do not typically do, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss any of the key points to get us started tonight. So I'm going to be as concise as I can be as we get this meeting started. So I have a few kind of primary points to share with you before we hear from Cam. First, as we explore school reconfiguration for Taconic and Green schools, we're influenced by both state and local factors. We began discussing our educational programming almost 3 years ago, aiming initially to address middle school programming needs, and over time and deeper exploration, we realized that the entire system required some attention. Second point, declining enrollment is impacting our programming, and we do not, at this point, need 5 schools to educate our children. A few of the ways we're experiencing this impact include, first, significant challenges with providing rigorous grade-level instruction, ensuring that students receive all grade-level content, particularly when we have multi-age classrooms. With only 1 classroom in many of our schools, students do not have the opportunity for new cohorts of students and different peer group, which is important developmentally for many of our students. Third, in an effort to ensure students receive a full year of grade level content, schools are allocating intervention level resources to putting them towards classroom instruction, which results in decreased opportunities for students who require supplemental instruction to access all of their education. Fourth, itinerant staff, including positions like school nurses, school counselors, special education staff, and unified arts teachers, mean that we have many of those positions that are part-time in local buildings. That is what we need to do because of the size of our schools. However, that means that our students don't have access to those resources every day, and we have quite a few students who need them. So we are essentially at this point not as educationally or financially efficient as we could be as a system. When these challenges are faced within the greater context of the anticipated state-level educational governance and funding changes, including very, very likely parameters for minimum class size, minimum school size, a foundation funding formula, we have some really important decisions to make as a community. As we listen to the information presented this evening and consider what's best for our students, we face an important decision. Do we make local decisions in the coming months to ensure our students receive an education and opportunities that we collectively want for them? Or do we wait, not make any changes, and see what a larger district without as much knowledge of us decides as they look at how to reconfigure? After giving it a lot of thought, I really felt as if ultimately my responsibility as a superintendent was to bring options to the board, and for the board to ultimately leave the decision to the taxpayers in our communities. I don't know how people are going to feel. If you want to make some decisions, particularly related to a bond and new construction for our community in the future, or you want to wait and see kind of how a larger system makes decisions about what's best for our kids. So as we work through this, I personally, and I know the board also, look forward to questions, thoughts, and feedback as we work through this process. This is hard. It's a hard conversation for me. It's a hard conversation, I believe, for the board. And I also believe that all of the folks here represent that people know that it's an important and big decision for our community. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn this over to the folks who will be presenting tonight. So we've got David Epstein from Truex Collins Camp. David, can you give a wave or something up there so folks can see you?
Yeah.
Okay, so he's on the screen right now. He's the second row, the first square. And so he's joining us virtually, and Cam Featherston-Haw is joining us in person, will be leading us here. Both work for Truex Collins. They've done a tremendous amount of work for us in the last couple of years. And I'll turn it over to you, Cam, okay?
Okay, thanks. So, are we going to put the presentation on the screen?
Yeah.
Greetings, folks.
Yes.
Yes.
It's really hard to hear back here.
Do we have a microphone?
Okay, my name is Cam Featherston-Haw. I'm a senior associate and architect at Truex Collins in Burlington, Vermont. I grew up in central Vermont. I lived here my whole life, and so it's an honor to be here and work with this group on these important issues. So we're going to bring the presentation up, and then we'll dive right
Yeah,
in.
my name is Dave Epstein. I'm a partner at Truex Collins, and together Cam and I work on school projects all over the state, on projects like this, as well as building and design projects and renovations and all sorts. So we're very immersed in the Vermont school state. We wanted to just talk about, can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, we're working on it.
Great. We're getting a lot of background noise. Oh, now it's better.
Are we advancing or not?
No? Can you go back one slide?
That's it.
There we go. So we did introductions. We're going to just review what we've been asked to do and what the schedule for that is. We're going to talk about some planning guidelines that were developed by the educators in the district, what the capacities of the schools, and then the meat of the presentation are talking about all the different planning options. And we'll wrap it up by looking at the cost models for a few of those options, and talk about next steps. And as Randy said, then we'll have a Q&A session for both the board and the public after that. So next slide, please.
This is me.
The purpose, what we were asked to do was iterate as many different configuration options in the district that made sense relative to the planning guidelines that were developed. And we developed 12 different options. And we worked with two different committees, the executive committee and a facilities committee. The executive committee was smaller, and they identified 5 options that merited cost modeling, 4 that may, and 3 that did not. And the 4 that may merit consideration, one of the issues is it's a lot of work to crunch all these numbers. So we wanted first to meet the facilities committee they identified 4 options to recommend to the school board: B, E1, H, and H1. And as Randy said, tonight the goal is, if possible, to have the board select 2 or 3 options that we can take forward, because these are very high-level configuration options, and once we have a smaller group, we can actually do the design work and test to see whether they truly work or not, and what the cost impact is. Next slide.
So this is a graphic schedule that shows, and it's probably too hard to read on the screen. Maybe some of you have handouts, but the big picture is that we're kind of getting to the end of the programming phase, where what we've done is we've tried to figure out what are the big moving pieces that are possible, and that's represented by these planning options. After this, we would move into more of a design phase, which is a little bit more what people think architects traditionally do, which is saying, okay, if this configuration option looks good, let's see if it actually works. It's a little bit like a feasibility study. Can we actually put that many students in that place? Does that work? Is there enough parking, etc.? So that's the next step, and that's kind of those blue bars that you see in the middle. That would take us through till about the beginning of the next school year, at which time we would sort of have our arms around what is really possible, what it looks like, what it would cost, and whether or not the board wants to ask the voters to make a decision on this through a vote. That happens during that yellow bar, which is kind of over the winter into sort of next town meeting day. And that's a time where there's going to be a lot more, we'll have a lot more information because we will have done feasibility studies, and there'll be community outreach period. So that's kind of the long view of the schedule. Next slide.
So part of the process was that we presented these very, very detailed questionnaires to the educational leaders of the district, which is the principals and the superintendent, and they asked a whole series of questions about what were the ideal arrangements, what's the best practice, what would be the most effective in terms of education. So these planning guidelines came from the educators, and we'll talk about it. Some of these are all about what's best for the kids, and some of them happen to also be more efficient from an operational standpoint. So one of the big concerns was busing times. There was a general consensus between 45 and 60 minutes was, when you start to get longer than 60 minutes, people were uncomfortable. And this is another one, equitable access to similar types of program offerings. Right now, the middle school experience is very different from school to school, as well as some of the elementary offerings. So that was a big focus. The class sizes was an interesting conversation because the capacity of the schools and the ability to consolidate is driven by many factors. One of those is class sizes. And you'll see I put a little asterisk there. Your class sizes are a bit smaller than the state's maximum class sizes. Interestingly enough, in some of the new legislation that's in the State House, they talk about minimum class sizes, not maximum. It's almost like the maximums are becoming the minimums. And then there was a strong preference for centralized preschool, and one of the things there's been a lot of talk about full day preschool, pre-K for 4-year-olds, and that adds, there's definitely space requirements that apply.
So some other planning guidelines that were developed were that elementary schools should be grades K through 5, or possibly grade banded. That would be when you would take like K through 2 and have a school that's early elementary, and books in that school really focus on that developmental age for 3 through 5, but at least they had to be K through 5. And then the minimum size was going to be a 2-section per grade, which means at least 2 classrooms for each grade. And that has a lot of benefits, both, as Randy said, increasing the size of the cohort. Kids can find other social groups if the one they're in doesn't work out. Also, it starts to balance out a number of part-time positions. When you hit that kind of 240, 250 students, you can have a full-time nurse, and other positions, full-time librarian, etc. So there's a kind of a natural break point. And also, we talked about the K through 2 classrooms. Really, the younger kids are they're taught much differently than they were when these schools were built. It used to be common that you would put kids in a class in rows, and they would face this kind of stand and deliver model. And there are many, many more modes of learning, especially at the younger grades. And they have activities in the classroom that are different than just sitting in desks and rows. So we wanted a little bit more, not we, but the planning guidelines indicated a little bit more space for younger grades. Next slide.
This next one was just a confirmation of, when we started with the district, there was a group and a strong feeling that we needed, that the district needed a regional middle school. Grades 6 through 8 was the preference, and that was reiterated during this process, that was a strong preference and a best practice. Next slide.
We also talked during this planning guidelines exploration about an alternative program. One for the district is going to be a therapeutic program. It's a little bit different than what's done now. There are therapeutic schools that some students are tuitioned out to, and it's very expensive. So one thing that can be explored is it less expensive, or are there other advantages to keeping those students in the district and having a therapeutic program that's part of this district curriculum. It's noteworthy that there's a moratorium on alternative school charters, and there aren't enough placements, so that's another driver. Next slide.
So let's talk a little bit about the capacities of the school. As you can see, Ben's is the largest school. Floodbrook has a lot of classrooms, and that's the second largest, and then Dorset is the third, and then of course Courier and Sunderland are much smaller. Using the Taconic graded class sizes, a 2-section per grade school is 192 to 240 numbers of students, and using the state guidelines, it's more like 255. And you can see that Dorset is barely large enough for a 2-section per grade school, where the other ones are quite a bit larger. Now, the way we calculate capacities is that we take all the classrooms that are being used as classrooms and calculate the capacity that way. Now, some of the schools, especially men's, has classrooms being used by special educators and other support specialists, and so the capacity, with some reconfiguration, the capacity of men's is actually greater than 450, but the way we're using it now, it's at 450. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the planning options. Next slide.
So that's just a title slide. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk first about a group of options that was discussed, but ultimately nobody on either the executive committee or the facilities committee thought that were worth pursuing or worth spending more time on. But in the interest of transparency, we'll talk about that and talk about why. So the first thing is we did model out the status quo, which is all the schools functioning as they do now. And if anyone has a handout to follow along, the planning criteria is down on the lower right of each page, and we kind of give it a little report card. do these schemes pass or fail planning criteria? So in this case, it passes the travel time goal, but the status quo fails all the other planning criteria in terms of equitable access to similar types of programs, no centralized preschool, only MEMS is a 2-section per grade elementary school, there's no regional middle school, and there's no alternative therapeutic program. Next slide. And you can skip to it. So these are the options that were not considered by the executive committee. So option C was to close or repurpose Courier and Sunderland and create a grade-banded system where all pre-K through 2 would go to the Dorset School, all 3 through 5 would go to Floodbrook, and all 6 through 8 would come to Manchester. And that would create sort of education centers based on the developmental age of students. This is one that the travel times and logistics didn't seem to be manageable. The time to transit across the district and take all of the students to one school, particularly with the kids coming down off the mountain and going to Dorset, was articulated to us as being unmanageable from a logistical standpoint. It would have required an addition at Dorset, which is challenging. We can see just because of the topography and the way the Dorset building is built and how it engages the hillside. Although we could put an alternative program in one of these repurposed schools, so it gets a pass. Next slide. Option E was a similar repurpose or close Courier and Sunderland. In this case, though, we would have a pre-K through 5 school in Dorset, a K through 5 school in Floodbrook, and Manchester would become a regional middle school, grades 6 through 8. This would require a majority of K through 5 students to be transported in a reverse flow up to Floodbrook. But an alternative purpose program could be in one of the repurposed schools. Folks just didn't feel like this option had legs because so many people are kind of going the wrong direction up the hill. Next slide. So option F was the last one that really didn't make it past the first threshold. This was keeping all the schools open, but making Courier, Floodbrook, and Sunderland really early childhood centers, just pre-K through grade 2. Sending all the 3 through 5s to the Dorset School with the pre-K through 2 from Dorset. And having pre-K through 2 in Manchester, stay in Manchester, and have the rest of the school become a regional middle school. It doesn't achieve a 2-section per grade minimum. The travel times from Floodbrook to Dorset exceed the travel time goal again. And also it doesn't have really any advantages in terms of utilizing space. It's would be one of the most space-intensive options because it keeps all the schools open. So it's inefficient from that standpoint. So, next slide. So these are category 2 options which were considered by the executive committee and discussed with the facilities committee, but not selected for advancement to this. So
with these two, this keeps Dorset, Floodbrook, and MEMS open, and there's a PK at Manchester. The Dorset and Floodbrook are K through 5. And you can see what happens is that the schools, Floodbrook only has 147 students. Dorset only has 159. They don't meet the criteria of grade section for grade schools. And so that one, you can see in the report card area does not meet that criteria. And you want to talk a little bit about the notes?
Yeah, so it would require an addition in Dorset for program equity, basically support staff. The middle school would require an addition, but we use a portion of the existing MEMS structure. It would require renovation of all the remaining schools to reallocate classroom space for more efficient use. But it's the least efficient use of space out of the options which were in that cohort when we were exploring at A, B, B1, and H1. So it's not a super efficient option space-wise. Next slide.
This A1, so what happened was we developed all the A, B, C, and then there would come an idea to do a variation on A, so, and that would be called A1. So A1 is a variation where what we were trying to do is keep more kids in the school so that they would be to scale. But even if you keep the 6th graders in Dorset and Floodbrook and Manchester, you're still, Floodbrook is 175 students, Dorset's 180. So it's still that criteria of creating a 2-section per grade school.
Yeah, essentially, we tried to make it more efficient by keeping more of the kids, the 6th graders, in the schools that are not met.
It also, you know, the goal from the very beginning was a middle school that was 6 through 8, and this is a middle school that's 7 through 8, so that was less desirable as well.
Next slide.
Okay, so D has Dorset, K through 5 at Floodbrook, pre-K through 5 at Manchester. The idea was, could we create a middle school at Dorset? So once again, Floodbrook, and this is pretty similar in all of the options. When we pull the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders out of Floodbrook, the school becomes much smaller. MEMS, in this case, grows much larger, up to 419. And now Dorset at 6 through 8 is 287 students, which, if you remember, the capacity of Dorset was 215. So now this requires an addition at Dorset, which you'll probably get tired of us hearing us say that it's a challenging thing.
Yeah, and Dorset's not a great middle school also because it doesn't have a full-size gym or sufficient field space, really. So those would be things to consider in this option. I think that although it's a little bit inconsistent, this does have the same problem of kids coming down from Floodbrook to Dorset and having that exceed the travel time goals. People felt, I think, more comfortable with that if it was the older kids. I don't know how you all feel about it, but that's just to be clear. Next slide.
So, G has 2 pre-K through 4 schools. Once again, we're keeping, in this one, Dorset is open and Floodbrook's open at pre-K 4, and the Manchester Middle School is 5 through 8. And now you can, you know, for the elementary schools, what happens here is that the pre-K through 4 students from the Manchester area, catchment area, are going up the hill to Floodbrook. So there's similar characteristics to the other one we looked at, where now we are getting scale at Floodbrook. We're getting pre-K through 4 at 285, and Courier's at 77, which is all of that inspection per grade school. This one is kind of a mixed bag. We can't talk about the notes.
Yeah, this one, again, would have the majority of K-5 students transported in kind of reverse flow. But I would note that this population scaled to these buildings really well. Like, the buildings were large enough to accept them, and there was a little bit of room to grow, kind of the right amount of room to grow. You know what I mean? So that's it on that one. Next slide.
So the H options, so there's an H, H1, and H2, which we'll talk about H and H1 in a sec. These all had basically consolidating all of the Manchester area for both elementary and pre-K. The difference with this one is that they're all at the MEMS campus, and that puts 900 students on that one campus, and people felt that that was just too many students, too many staff, and we haven't done any studies of that, but we suspect that's true, that it would be very difficult to get all the parking that we needed and all the parking fields on the site comfortably, and so this one was not brought forward.
Yeah, it would have required additions to the middle school, obviously. It would have required renovation of MEMS to reallocate classroom space. Again, reformat what used to be classroom space as classroom space. This was a very efficient option in terms of space use, for what it's worth. But David said it all. There was a concern about the number of students, in particular parking. And there's really not all the fields here either, so we'd be relying on kids going up the hill to the rec center. So it's not a perfect fit. Next slide. So these next four are the ones that both resonated with the executive team, but also with the facilities committee, and they wanted to have the board consider them in this public forum.
So they basically fall into two categories. There's B and B1 and H and H1. And in the B options, Floodbrook is kept open. And in the H options, Floodbrook would have to be one of the schools that was repurposed. And so they're all, B and B1 are variations on theme, and so are H and H1. So to start, B keeps Floodbrook open as K through 5, and once again, it's 147 students, so it doesn't meet the criteria. And then MEMS is at 419, and then there would be an addition at MEMS for the middle school.
So this is still 700 students at the MEMS site. And as David said, it would require addition and renovation. We still have that concern about the number of students and parking. This is one where that feasibility study that would come next, if people want to learn more about it, it would be really important to make sure that it actually could work before trying to go down this road. Next slide.
So B1, as I mentioned, is similar in terms of Floodbrook. The only difference between B and B1 is that B1, instead of an addition to MEMS, there would be a new middle school and on a site to be determined. And so the idea was to build, in this option, you could build a state-of-the-art middle school, it could have all the playing fields, and it wouldn't compromise the MEMS site in terms of parking. So that was, the difference between B and B1 is whether it's an addition to MEMS for the middle school or it's a new build.
I would just add that this option is not the most efficient. It's kind of middle of the pack. The reason is because we're not getting great utilization out of the Floodbrook school. It's at less than half capacity. But we're building a new school for the middle school students, so you just end up with more square footage than some of the other options. But it does kind of resolve, we have far fewer concerns about 419 students on this campus. There's been more than that in the past. Next slide.
So as I mentioned with option H consolidates all the students to the Manchester area, and whereas we were looking at H2, it's at everybody on the MEMS site. H has a new middle school and all the pre-K through 5 students at MEMS. So that's 568 students at men's, and then who Bell High School, who middle school, contributes to that.
So this one we think could be done without an addition here. It's getting close to the most number of students that have been in this building in the past, but we think with some creative reconfiguration it's possible. This option is it's consistent with the state's school size priorities for whatever that's worth for folks. This is a very efficient option. It's one of the most efficient options out of the bunch in terms of the space usage. I've said that a lot, and I'll just clarify for folks. In these explorations, we found that there's a direct correlation between the efficiency of space use and the projected costs over time. And it's kind of intuitive because you have less to take care of, you have fewer spaces that need to be programmed and staffed. It's everything from, if you have 3 schools servicing 900 kids, then you have 3 gyms. If you have 2 schools servicing 900 kids, you have 2 gyms. 3 libraries versus 2 libraries, 3 kitchens versus 2 kitchens. So that's why I keep bringing it up. I think we've said all on that one. The next slide, and this is the final option.
So the only difference with H1 was that MEMS now is pre-K through 4 and the middle school's 5 through 8. And the reason for doing that was to try and get the numbers at MEMS a little lower and get the numbers at the middle school a little higher. But that could free up some space at MEMS that could be used for potentially alternative program there or central offices. We haven't quite gone into those yet. But it was just trying to balance numbers a little bit with this one.
Next slide. Oh, back one.
Okay. Yep, there we go.
So we've done some cost modeling to try and look at what are these options, what does it really mean? And so we've done a 30-year outlook, which is based on the fact that to do any of these projects requires taking out a bond. And so we want to know is there payback on this term? If you're taking out a 30-year loan, is there payback over that period? So we look at a number of things. It's both the cost of your deferred maintenance, what we've already discovered through facility evaluations is needed in the schools to keep them in proper working order. We also look at operations and maintenance costs because buildings always need to be worked on. For the operations and maintenance value, we use what's called 2% net replacement value. This is what's recommended by the Association of Physical Plant Administrators, which is kind of like facility operators, facility directors. They have a whole slew of recommendations for how you budget for operations of K-12 facilities in the U.S. For capital renewal, which I talked about, we're using 100% of the deferred maintenance from the facility evaluations. In the no bond option, that amount escalates because you have to pay for it over time, so your costs go up over time. When you bond for the work, you lock it in today's dollars because you're borrowing a bunch of money and you pay it off over time. And you pay either the same amount per year or actually even sometimes the bond payments, the payments themselves go down year over year, as opposed to paying for it in today's dollars, which means in 10 years you're paying for it in 10 years dollars after inflation and everything else. We figure in the new construction costs as part of the bond as well. We look at the salaries, benefits, and the fuels, which is kind of like what does it cost to actually operate the school. Building it is one cost, but actually it's a far larger cost to staff the school and pay for it to operate. That's the biggest part of it. If you look at these graphs, the dark blue bars that are on top, that's the salaries and benefits and fuels that it costs to operate the schools. And then we've escalated those salaries, benefits, and fuels over time at 4%, which is, I think, when we talk to the facilities business or the business manager, it's usually, I think we were feeling like 4.2% is a good metric moving forward. It's been more in the past, it's been less. I mean, sometimes healthcare goes up by itself 7 or 8 or 11% in a year, but 4% felt like a good target both to be commit to some control, but not be too optimistic. I'm sorry, my slide went away. And I wanted to make sure that people knew that these do include renovations for all the deferred maintenance. So when we talk about these numbers and these cost calculations, we're not leaving something on the table to try and make it rosy. Decisions to do or not do things can be made in the future by people who run the school. But we're assuming that all these things will get done so that we have the most conservative cost modeling that we can do. Next slide.
I think it's important to note that the salaries, benefits, and fuels number was provided by the district. They provided that information for us. So this summarizes the different categories, 0, categories 2 and 3. We did not cost model anything in category 1 because it was not considered viable. But I want to point out in category 0 that what this is saying is that if you did nothing but just bond for all your deferred maintenance, that over 30 years, you'd save $307 million versus trying to pay for all of that each year in your budget. And that's for the reasons Ken stated. You know, you're borrowing today's dollars and you're getting it done and not having to escalate each year. So that's about a 10% savings. And when you think about it, it's like that means it's about $3 billion to operate the district over the next 30 years. When we got to category 2, you can see when we started looking at option A, which is the only one identified originally by the effectiveness committee, the cost modeling, it actually was more expensive and saved less money. And then we did not model the rest of the options in category 2. But in category 3, we did. So just to, can we go to the next slide, please? Getting a lot of background noise, so it keeps coming and going. All right, so you can see here that the B and B1, which keep Floodbrook open, have about a $400 million to $362 million savings, and then closing Floodbrook and doing those consolidated options is slightly more. And I think one of the things that's worth pointing out is that the difference between, let's say, option O, a lot of people ask, well, if option O is 9.7 and option B is 12.6, what are we getting for that, 3 percentage points of savings? And I think the answer is that you're getting all the things in those planning guidelines that the educators felt was important, like schools that are larger that can offer more programming, that can be staffed more consistently, that have better opportunities socially and for after school, and you're having less deferred maintenance. So you're getting all the educational benefits in that extra 3% that you would get otherwise. Next slide.
I think it's worth noting too that the B and H options, they do align with the state's stated goals. So it feels like those configurations would survive transition to another governing body, which is something that's been in the back of our minds. You know, what is the future going to be permitted to continue on course by another body that takes over supervision and governance of this area?
So, you know, some of the findings that we just wanted to highlight were that, as I said earlier, that bonding for projects saves substantial amounts of money versus trying to budget on a yearly basis for capital renewal and deferred maintenance. And as Cam was saying earlier, that the options that have less overall square footage and fewer facilities with greater capacity seem to be the ones that yield the greater long-term savings. And that you can't, achieving any of these kinds of savings, for big configuration or otherwise, requires an investment. You know, it's like, it's kind of, you have to spend to save in a way, but, and then finally, achieving equity, you know, that's some of the, when we do this cost model, we figure out what spaces each school needs. And we're looking at both two things. We're looking at capacity, and we're also looking at equity. So if one school has an art room, then the other school has to have an art room. If one school has a music room, the other school. So we're trying, so some of that creation of equity also requires investment. And those are just some of the key things to think about when looking at all the different options. And I think that concludes the formal part of our presentation. And I think now we'd like to take questions, clarifying questions, I believe, from the board.
Yep. So just kind of a reminder of how we're looking to the flow. We'll spend out 15 minutes with the board. Then we'll address the public for questions for the architect and superintendent for about 15 minutes, and then return back to the board to hopefully be able to make a recommendation. John.
I have three quick clarifying questions back to back. Who is on the executive committee? Who's on the facility committee? And what is the size of the bond in option H1? I see, is that included in the cost model?
Thank you.
Do you want to answer the questions, Randy, about the participants in the committees?
Sure. So the small team was me, superintendent, Sue Wilborn, business, facilities, Adam Bassett, and transportation, Derek Chalmers. So as our internal team to be looking at the logistics operationally about what was feasible and what wasn't. The facilities committee had, we had a parent, Jill DeRocher, we had a teacher, Scott Dietrich, we had a principal, Jen Turner, we had two board members, Ben Freeman and Mel Virgilio, we had me, and then the same facilities, business, transportation. So we tried, I think I got everybody, tried to represent as many communities as possible and
Now, and to answer your question about the cost modeling, it is a conservative approach that includes everything. So it includes all the costs for new construction, all the costs for renovations and for deferred maintenance that have been discovered in the schools through our facility evaluation, and I think does that answer your question?
What's the size of the bond that it's based on? You know, like what are those costs combined
I have that information.
In the bond.
I have that information in our spreadsheets, but I don't have it at my fingertips. I can provide it after the fact if you want. Because it's different for each one. I mean,
I'm just talking about the option H1 with bond, it says. Now, I know the cost modeling you have on this page.
I just don't have those spreadsheets on this computer. I could look it up if you wanted me to, but it's a number of different numbers that go into it, both for, because we carry one number for the deferred maintenance, we carry another number for new construction. So I can look those up and provide them.
All for just H1, all those, you're saying there's different numbers all for H1?
Yes, because
Okay.
when you do the I don't want to belabor this, but when you do the reconfiguration, there is new construction, and we figure that at kind of one cost. And then there's also deferred maintenance, which is, we think, unknown, or we have a good idea of what it costs from the cost estimates that have already been done.
So the bond interest rates baked into that too?
The bond interest rates are baked into that, and we went to the Vermont Bond Agency, and we didn't share any information about who it was for, but we asked them to provide us bond repayment schedules for this size bond. And it's a different size for each option, because each option, has different sizes of additions and different amounts of deferred maintenance.
Can I just clarify also, does that include the salaries, benefits, fuel, everything that's listed here? Okay.
It's soup to nuts.
David?
Dick.
Sorry.
Can I just add one thing, which is that we were very diligent, we tried to be very diligent about using the same assumptions for each model, so that because we want where their value is not the total amount saved, but it's relative to each other. That we think that is significant, that is meaningful. It's how do they compare relative to each other, because all the assumptions were kept consistent. So I wouldn't, we're not guaranteeing that option H is going to save you $400 million, but we're just saying relative to the other options, this is how it performs.
Well, and if all of the actions taken in the future match our assumptions, which we think are reasonable assumptions, but it's worth noting that this discussion is not about the particular savings of one. I don't think it's about the particular savings of one option. It's about what options look strategically the best, because this is about kind of stripping away the minutia to say if you make these big moves, it has this scale of impact potentially. That's kind of setting a strategic direction. Like, okay, we want to look more at this and we want to look more at that. All the knobs and dials have to get turned from here in the future by all the people who are going to participate. And you could save more, you could save less, depending on which knobs and dials you turn. So this is really a strategic direction discussion. And then as we progress, you get more and more detail, and you get a better and better sense. It's still reliant on people in the future taking the actions that we thought they were going to take or close to it. But does that make sense, folks?
Okay.
All right, Dick.
Has the cost of land, because you're not in H1 and B1, you've assumed that you're not building at MENS, therefore you have to build somewhere else. Has the cost of land, and more in particular, the availability of enough land, been relatively assured?
That's an excellent question, and I'll say that we don't have a piece of land in sight, although there was an exploration of this as part of the middle school process, and there may or may not be some sites that people think may or may not be available. The acquisition costs are not figured in expressly, but they also represent a small fraction of 1% of the total costs. It's a little bit like a rounding error. We would assume that would be caught in the next round of modeling, but it's a very, very small fraction.
And another, on a slightly different trend, H1 and B1 assume, I believe, if I've read it correctly, that the middle school would be composed of 5, 6, 7, and 8. There were expressed during the middle school committee's session some concern about sixth graders, but the model assumes that now fifth grade is going to be engaged and involved. Has there been some discussion at the superintendent's level as to the appropriateness of 5, 6, 7, 8, and what are the advantages of that other than fixing school size in terms of a middle school experience versus the 6, 7, and 8?
So if the board decided to move forward with looking at 5, 6, 7, 8 middle school, the proposal for me would be to split out 5 and 6 into one area and 7, 8 in another. I am in agreement that we've had two committees who've landed on 6, 7, 8. So to make that adjustment, I think would have to be a thoughtful discussion here. But I think it's worth discussing because of some of what we found out through this process. My recommendation would be, again, splitting it into two, sort of really two well-defined sections within the same building.
I appreciate the question. It's partly also us kind of trying to unpack as many opportunities to explore, because it's frankly, it's easy and it's not as expensive right now to explore some of these as, you know, a page with a little map and a little bit of number crunching. You know what I mean? So it seemed to work.
John.
Someone else go before me first. I don't know who to direct this question to, but for A1, what's the rationale for the regional pre-K as opposed to having, you know, what's the rationale for regionalizing pre-K?
David, I would ask you a question.
For Dorset and Clubbrook, we could have pre-K offerings there. I feel like pre-K, what a community might want is access, you know, keeping young kids closer to their homes. And, you know, I'm just trying to think why regionalize that name. Why not put up, you know, a valley pre-K and a mountain pre-K, which helps solve some of our capacity problems. And also along with that, you know, some of the capacity problems there. I know you talked about trying to get into the DRSU office space, using that here, you know, during capacity of one of those buildings there. Again, I don't know who that's a Danny question or Cam, I don't know who that's, but.
Well, Randy, you can jump in. I'll start. It's interesting that in all of the districts that we're working in, not just in this one, when we talk to educators in particular, there is this drive for centralized pre-K. I can't remember if it's this district or not, so I apologize for that. But what we've heard over the course of these conversations is that pre-K schools, well, pre-K is a very specialized. It's really almost more like a daycare than it is like a traditional elementary school in terms of. And I say that from not in terms of what happens in them, that could be interpreted badly, but the way the space is set up. You know, kids sleep. There's sleeping spaces. There's specialized in full-day pre-K. There's kind of specialized people. They're having it all in one place. Has been asked for by everyone we've talked to. So I didn't really question it as much. Randy, what would you add?
So I would say that we haven't spent a lot of time on pre-K. That's come up at other forums, mostly because of the guidelines around whether we can open a pre-K right now and where we can open up and what capacity there is within the community. I would say that that is a detail that from my perspective is one of the most flexible. Cam's right, there's definitely a bent to the idea of an early learning center. However, from my perspective, if Floodbrook remains open and there's a capacity need on the mountain, I would 100% support a pre-K up at Floodbrook. We haven't been able to do that yet. So I would say that is, I think that there's flexibility there. I wouldn't get too hung up on that only because we don't know what's going to be possible.
I would second the flexibility.
Kelsey, I saw your hand first.
I have a couple of questions. At the beginning, you mentioned preschool full day. Would that be 5 days a week or 4 days a week?
That's a detail we haven't. Right, and it depends on where it is and agreements and collective bargaining stuff. There's no way to get at that level of detail right now.
So then my other question is, there seems to be some hesitancy about saying that Manchester down to Floodbrook. My concern, or we look into transporting Floodbrook students up to Manchester, because that seems to be a lot. We want to bus them up here based on these options, and I'm concerned about the roads, the traveling. I know just for this year for Manchester, we're not on the GIST program, it's 8 weeks, they have to cancel 3 of those days just because they can't get from me. So I'm concerned about students, and if they can't get to Manchester, they just aren't going to get the education that day. Do you think that?
Depending on where things ultimately land, there will likely continue to be more system-wide closures and delays. And I think that the concern is the flow up and down. So, if we decide, yes, we're going to transport kids up the mountain, which goes against the flow coming down, and that was what the board ultimately decided, that would then, which is fine, but necessitate very staggered start times, right? Because we just, as a system, we have the capacity to be running alternate routes going opposite directions all at the same time.
Rainey, can I
So
clarify?
there's definitely, there's always, no matter what is decided, going to be other impacts, to decisions in the future wherever things land.
I just want to clarify, I think when you're saying coming down and going up, we're talking about the transportation for the upper levels that come down to Manchester in the afternoon, so.
Well, any, morning and afternoon.
Right, but we have already flow coming down the mountain
Right.
anyway. So that's why she's saying coming down and then also going up is what's added to that.
That's 15.
So we'll take a few more questions from here. I know Lindsay has a question, Jim. Celeste, is there anyone online? Deb, Jeff, or Jessica online? I just want to kind of put in queue. Deb, questions? I'm going to say no. Lindsay.
I was just wondering why it didn't seem to be any of the options and maybe it was one that we considered was the proposal that Ben had suggested of doing possibly a northern, middle, and southern school. Because when we first started discussing this, there was, we might need to close one school. And now most of these options are closing all but 1 or 2. So I'm just wondering how we went from possibly one school closing to almost all school closings. And then it seemed like when Ben had brought up the proposal of the north, middle, and southern schools, the reaction from the community seems to kind of favor that, and why that wasn't brought up as one of the options here.
Is that for me, probably?
I don't know.
I'm happy to answer it. I don't want to put forth something that isn't going to have a viable future down the line. So it's really important to me that whatever is being put forth to you as a board and ultimately the community will hold up based on whatever's coming down the pipe. And I think I am confident that minimum class sizes will be established, that there'll be minimum school sizes that are considered. And so I did not want to propose something that would not be kind of viable in the future. And so, yeah, I mean, it's that simple. How do we get to an economy of scale and ensure solid quality programming so that no matter what happens, this conversation and this work and the attention to our future is worth the investment we're making in time and decisions.
You have Jessica and then Linus.
Okay, Jim's up next.
I just wonder, what happens to the schools that are closed, and is that a cost, or how does that affect the calculations?
We have not included cost for repurposing the schools in our cost model. The schools that would be closed or repurposed, and that's definitely a consideration. Often, what happens is the town will sell, the district will sell to the town the school for $1 or whatever, and it becomes their issue. But they may, it's going to take some creative problem solving to repurpose those schools into, viable community centers.
Jim.
One facility we operate right now, we're not including in this, which is the central office. I'm just curious whether you thought about how that could fit in with other plans.
I am not confident we will have a central office to consider someplace. So at this point, we're not including that. I think that the reality is that's unlikely as we look ahead.
We are holding a planning module for the central office, and it's similar to what the size of space they have now. And as we move forward, we can look at plugging it into different places, but we are kind of waiting to see what develops in Montpelier. I mean, that relates to the pre-K question too about full day. I think that lands on our plate if that's under consideration in Montpelier. Maybe. I think it'll really happen everywhere once it becomes a requirement.
I have Jessica and Maddie, and then we'll move. Question?
Yes, I do. I'm just wondering, based on these recommendations, include a brand new facility, and I'm just wondering how the cost modeling works about all these buildings. Is it just because the maintenance is so high that building in place is a better idea?
Yes, essentially you're correct. When you take the deferred maintenance off the books for the schools that would not continue, you don't have to plan to spend that money. So over the course of the next 20, 30 years, you take the money you would have spent on those buildings and you put it into a new facility. And because you're condensing the amount of space, when you do that, you have less ongoing cost in the future. So it just doesn't stack up as fast. That's essentially what's happening.
And one of the schools, I believe it was Courier, had a 78% FCI, which is a Facilities Condition Index, which means that 78% of the building is depleted. And so essentially, by taking that school off the books, because you really almost in effect having to replace the school when you take care of its deferred
fine.
I've worked on too many of these.
Madison, do you have one more question before?
In option H and H1, where it would be like all the schools come together, I know, like, when I was in middle school, that athletics was like that. So my question kind of is, do you think this would help or hurt middle school and elementary athletics? Because at Burger, there's none right now, when there was so many options when I was going career. So, and I know like the middle schools would play each other, like Brooklyn would play Madison, Dorset would play Madison, but bringing them all together with that, limit options for kids to play sports, would it like give them less schools to play and have to go further, or would it help them by being huge bigger, by bringing all the interested kids together?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, there's a lot of opportunity. So whether it's athletics, whether it's the arts, whether it's tech, whether it's co-curricular, at the elementary or the middle level, we have, again, some economies of scale that we can build based on interests and needs in a way that right now, sort of that diffuse nature, it can be very contingent on external factors rather than sort of a commitment to certain tenets of the program out of school.
Okay, folks. If you would, we do not have microphones. I'm sure you're familiar with what that feels like being out there. If you would, when you have your questions, I'll go ahead and call on you. You can stand up and give us your name, the town you're from, just for our record, and just be nice and loud so we can answer you the best we can.
My name is Leon Ward. I'm a Manchester resident. I've put 4 kids through this school so far. I have 1 currently here, and I have 1 starting in the fall. Yeah, I've been busy. I'm a designer and a planner. I've been on the Manchester Planning Commission for going on 7 years now. And so I like to keep in mind, when I think about things, the design of everything, how it all works together, how it flows. And there's a lot of what they pointed out tonight. It is with logistics, with buses, it's a very tough thing to do. Now, one of the plans that I like B1, I like H, those are nice plans, but there's some things you guys are missing. I feel like you're missing something as a planner, because as someone who drops kids off here every morning, this is a terrible elementary school. Awful. Elementary school kids also do not walk home from school. Middle school kids do. So this is a great middle school, because the kids, they leave, a lot of them just hit the streets walking home. So if you're going to build a new school, I would recommend keeping this in middle school, turning some of these into offices for Randy, and building a new elementary school. Now, Gore Farm, if you call it Gore Elementary, I think it would be a big sell for Don. Have the use of the facilities of the park for both schools. And with the new elementary school being single level, it'll be a lot better than how it is at pre-K and elementary with all the stairs. You could have a big circle in the front for parents to drop their kids off, drop their pre-K kids off, buses could park in the back. It'll just be a much better facility than trying to make it down in middle school and this is elementary. So that's my opinion.
Thank you, Ann. Other questions for the
Now, are we
architects?
looking for questions or are they comments or questions? I'm not trying to.
The idea, right. The idea is for questions.
But that was
For
the question too, why wasn't that considered?
Anyone want to answer that question?
Actually, we think we did think about that, and it might have even gotten talked about. The size of the planned middle school is such that this school is much larger than it would need to be. So there'd be a lot of extra room to use space. Although I don't disagree with the things you said from sort of 10,000-foot level. There is some value, I think, in exploring that. So I take it in the spirit in which it's offered, which I think was this could be a good alternative.
What's your question?
My name is Hillary Davis. I'm a Manchester resident. My son goes to Dorset in 6th grade.
My question is, if the governor's legislation gets passed, which I'm assuming some variation of it will, and we narrow down to 6 districts, I think it is there a risk that this brand new school we might be building would be shut down? Or are they planning to keep, like, how are they figuring out how many facilities to keep as they narrow down the district count?
Can you hear okay?
Yeah, so Hillary, that's what I was commenting in response to Lindsay's question, is that the planning and what we're proposing now is aligned with what is anticipated in a way that would allow us to say, this is what we want for Taconic and Green, and the proposals are an economy of scale that would meet the criteria of whatever's coming down. So the reason that we didn't put forth some of the other options is because there's too high of a likelihood that we would go through this work and then somebody would say the school's not big enough, it's not serving enough students. So it's great you did all this work and you're going to start combining in different ways. So that's why we're at the scale that we are at this point.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
To kind of touch on that same conversation, my name's Donna, I have Bloodbrook kids. If Bloodbrook chooses to stay open with that same conversation, does that put us in a situation where they might want to close us in the future?
Yes.
Like, is that something we should be concerned with if we didn't, like, regionalize down here in that, is if Bloodbrook does stay open? Or
Yes.
is that putting us in a bad place for then maybe having to join with like Chestertown, which is something that Bloodbrook family, Mountain Town families really didn't want, which is why we're BRSU.
So at this point, yes. And that is why the proposal that's here tonight is including that as an option. Having said that, this landscape right now is kind of all consuming me on every level right now. So whether I'm looking at what's happening federally, whether I'm looking at the conversations and watching many meetings at the State House, or informing conversations, or trying to understand what's happening, I am, for all the mountain folks right now, I'm on the back end of this trying to say, okay, if Bloodbrook stays open, what are some of the levers that I can advocate for to stabilize that system to have enough students? So while you're hearing, where we are at this moment, even just in a meeting I was in earlier today, I threw out some ideas of how might we be able to keep Bloodbrook open and stabilize it to protect it. So I think that's important as we're talking about things coming up, but yeah, you're right.
Would adding pre-K to Bloodbrook then create also more kids in that district to kind of put us in the same place? Because that was another conversation of like, why is it centralized just in Manchester? Why hasn't pre-K ever been brought up for the mountain towns? I mean, again, we have 2 private schools that do our pre-K options, and does that put them in a bad place? But again, is that something that would be looked at?
That's exactly right. So the reason we haven't been able to open a pre-K site at Bloodbrook is because of the capacity and the rules that we face as a public system to open a public pre-K when we have independent providers in a community. The state's model is very, I'm going to use the word protected, that's probably not the right word, but it values the partnership between private providers and public. So a public system can't take steps that will do exactly what you're saying, which is close a private provider pre-K. And so far, when we look at this, which we do every couple of years, the numbers don't pan out for there to be enough need on the mountain for us to open a public pre-K program up there.
But does it look like an issue with everything going on in the state, even for those private schools to even be able to stay open? Because if we lose our funding for private schools, families then can't afford to send their kids there, and then we're met with the same challenges that having pre-K centralized, because a lot of families don't send their kids up on the mountain because there's not enough space. Because enrollment, you know.
So I don't know what's going to happen with the pre-K legislation. As Pam and David said, if you've watched it at all, there's definitely conversation about whether 4-year-old pre-K starts falling under the school age, right, within that bucket versus being separate. So we're watching all of that. There's a lot of unknowns right now, but we'll factor in as things progress. We'll continue to factor in all of those considerations.
Thank you. Somebody online?
Heather Stevenson?
Heather, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thank you. Yes. I know there's been a lot of middle school studies, and this all one from feels very different in a lot of ways than the previous one. I'm happy to report that you all are flexible. Even tonight, there are seemingly more subjections not included in the options presented. I personally am a proponent of stabilizing public school and not closing public school. My most important question is, are you all planning to do an equity impact assessment? And are you prepared as a board to pick 2 or 3 to move forward to the public domain? That's the way you get me most curious about.
Randy, do you want to answer the equity?
I don't understand the question.
Heather, can you clarify the equity planning assessment?
Meaning, you know, how does this impact the communities if we close public school, which acts as a de facto community center? How far are people traveling? Who's traveling to Rivers? How many kids are traveling to Rivers? What is their capacity to move? You know, an equity assessment. Those are just some of the things that come to mind right off the top.
Do you have a thought for that?
I guess I'm not sure that about the use of the word equity as it relates to what you described it, but if you're talking about
when we close a school, that's kind of
As in who is impacted most directly from the closure of a school, is that right?
yeah, I mean, a lot of levels equity, but yes.
This is not my forte, so please forgive me. I'm feeling a little bit risky about opening my mouth right now. But I'll say that we put a lot of, both us as architects, but also the leadership here, the board leadership and the administrative leadership have been working to put a lot of equity-related issues on the table. And we've been focusing primarily on equity and educational opportunity, making sure that all the schools that would remain, if there's 3 or 2 or however many school buildings, that no matter where you live in the district or in the SU, and no matter which school your student goes to, they have the same opportunities as all the other students. And that's been the big equity lens that I think we have tried to manage. There are certainly other equity lenses, you know, and in some ways, and this makes me really nervous about saying this, but just from an outsider looking in, the option H's are the most equitable for everyone except for the people who live in Manchester, because that means there's only one town with schools. So it kind of hits all the other towns the same. And I'm not suggesting that that's fair or that that's right. But I think more feedback and comments like this can help add layers of understanding, can help us add additional lenses to the work that we're doing. And that's kind of where I would go from here. Because I think we're still at a waypoint, you know, and there's let's say the board says, yeah, we really like this, we really like B1 and H1. I'm just thinking creatively. Well, we have to go in and kind of redo those options. It's not a full reinvention, but we have to actually go and make sure these things work. We find that oftentimes the plans sometimes they tighten up and it's less space than we thought. Sometimes it just doesn't work out because of the building configuration and it's more space. But it's another opportunity for us to kind of have those conversations, and it provides more time to have these conversations as a broader community. So I don't know if that helps or answers the question.
It does, it definitely helps.
And Heather, I'll just...
I would also add that, typically in the next stage, you would have a consultant do a transportation study. So you look at what are the travel patterns from all the different areas and kind of figure out what the catchment areas if you have multiple schools open. And then, the transportation coordinator here in the district would say, well, look, we could achieve the 45 minutes, but we're going to have to buy less like that. So it's not a fixed in stone, but that is part of what we often look at in the next stage.
And Heather, I'll just answer your other question. I don't know if we're prepared. That's the goal. That's our hope. We'll find out in the next 30 minutes.
Thank you. That's all really helpful.
And there's one more online.
One more. Karen May.
Karen?
Karen, are you there?
If she comes back, just let me know. Audience, question out there?
Hi, Holly Wendell from Dorset. I have a 7th grade student at Dorset, so actually he'll be in high school by the time this happens. So I'm also a school administrator. So I guess I have just a couple of comments on that question. The first is I worry that we are moving forward with decisions that affect the community before we really know what's going to come out in the legislature. There are so many different options, and one of the reasons there are so many options is because the model is going to be really hard to fit across the state of Vermont. So as they're finding loopholes, one of the proposals, there isn't even a full bill out yet, one of the proposals has a lower, they're looking at class sizes because, we have to look at the entire state of Vermont. One of them identified regions where this kind of wouldn't work, keeping within that 75 minutes. And I agree with you, Randy, completely that I feel like there's a lot coming down to be really concerned about. But I feel like moving before we even know where they're going to be headed, and before there actually is a written bill, makes me feel a little bit concerned. The second thing is that in these proposals, there's almost no allowance for middle school students to go to private school funded across the entire state. It's one of the hard lines that doesn't sit in any of the proposals yet. Meaning there's some flexibility for some independent schools. I work in independent schools. There's some flexibility for independent schools in one of the proposals, but none of them so far have any flexibility for K through 8. And so I guess I'm wondering, that's going to be some students out of Long Trail has a huge middle school. We've got a middle school out of the Mountain School. We have a middle school at Stratton Mountain School, where we have 45 kids that are going to be affected by this. We've got, and so we've got all these independent students who are going to now come into our market when they lose their funding to go to the independent schools because we can't fundraise enough to keep these students necessarily. We're going to try. But so I guess the question is, would you consider, knowing all those factors, vetting out a model, having one of the proposals have what a lot of the community members, I think, felt like was going to happen, like a mountain school and down here looking at Dorset and Floodbrook and Men's, to not put any proposal forward that involves some kind of looking into this and really doing the numbers on those, adding in the private school students who will come back into your market. I really think that that's an oversight, because I feel like if we vet that out at the end of that, maybe we find out that there is some room in the legislature for smaller communities to have flexibility in class size, and now we've kind of like decimated our communities and our schools, putting many kids on a hill that should not be traveled in the winter by young kids, and helping to kind of make it safer, I think, before we even know what's going to happen. So I guess I'm just asking if you would consider looking and adding a model back in that has the flood-broken Dorset and MEMS model, so that the community could really see what was going to be affected when all the students come back out of the private schools and the bills come out of the house.
So I would say that for sure there's, you know, you're very aligned with a lot of our thinking from the very beginning. We want to attract a bunch of middle schoolers back to Taconic and Green. That's been part of our conversation from the beginning. We want to create a program that doesn't exist here that a lot of people want to come to. So we're definitely keeping an eye on that. It all, you know, it's going to come down to numbers and how things shake out. I don't see indication that the model of 3 K-8 buildings, you know, the work we've done on that is that we don't have the economy of scale to provide the type of robust programming that we want for our middle schoolers using that model. But the idea of building a middle school that has space for students to return from other schools, for sure is something that I anticipate the board will talk about. So I think there's going to be some adjustments to where we are, and we'll keep building and adjusting as we go.
We're going to hit just a few more questions.
Just a quick point of clarity, I'm sorry to interrupt. I actually like the idea of the regional middle school. I meant multiple elementary model in the middle school. So I wasn't talking about throwing out that. I support that.
Okay. So that's what I was saying earlier in response to the question over here around looking at, Holly, exactly what you said. If there's a way to build stability, and some of that is going to be contingent, I don't think that there's a benefit. While there's a lot of things that are unknown, there are certain aspects of what's being discussed at the state level that are very, very stable. That's what we're building our plans on, is that stability and the consistency of the messaging. The details that still have some flexibility are not part of what is in our proposal, so that we're still able to move forward with providing a more stable education, because there's not, it doesn't matter how many districts there are when we know that there is, there'll be minimum class size, there'll be minimum school size information coming out. There's no plans or bills or proposals that contradict that, no matter what is being presented. And I would be really surprised, and you can all call me on it, if next week somebody comes out and we get something going that says, nope, it doesn't matter. We can still have 3 kids in a class, and that's fine. And we can have a school of 13 kids, and that's fine. And I just don't see it, not based on where we are right now.
We have another green sweater.
My name is Carol DuPont. I just wanted to say, I hope you all take into consideration that this will have a tremendous financial impact on this part of Vermont. If I had young children again, I certainly wouldn't move to a place where I had to put them on a bus for 45 minutes. I'd choose another place.
And we, just so you know, you probably know this if your parents, most of our routes are 45 to 60 minutes.
No.
So it's that, Derek is here, I'm telling you, we have a lot of routes that are that long. That doesn't exceed many of our routes. For sure, not all of them, but we spend a lot of time with this. So, just
Yeah, my name is Cliff Damaris. I live in Wynn Hall, so I'm actually not a voter of the Dunston Green School District, just to put that out there. I have a little bit of a unique perspective. I teach in the middle school up at Floodbridge School. I also drive the bus from time to time, fill in routes. I've done everything from kindergarten all through 12th grade, currently licensed 5 through 12 in social studies and 5 through 9 in English. Apart from the cost part, which, you know, when I look at the research, I continue to see people quoting National Education Policy Institute over and over again, saying things like, a century of consolidation has already produced most of the efficiencies obtainable in systems of size. You see that sort of thing again and again, which is, you know, discouraging. And I want to start by just thanking the board for all of the work you're doing with this. This is incredibly thankless work. This is hard. It's something we all need. We understand the system is entirely unsustainable. Every year, taxes go up and up and up. And I don't want to say that out loud as a public school teacher, I'll be honest with you. I live in one of the most highly taxed towns in the area. But I think it also belies a conversation that I don't think happens enough, which is that we're not talking about the metrics that really matter for a system like this. So I actually want to say that while I do think we need to figure out this system a little bit better, and that I think it's great that we looked at a number of creative models, I do not support a regional middle school as a middle school teacher. When I look at the outcomes, I'm reading studies from Graduate School of Education at Harvard. They're quoting Columbia. They're quoting all of these places that cite pretty clearly that students who go through K-8 schools have higher achievement levels when they get to high school. There are amazing opportunities we can offer in a regional middle school. That's great. We obviously all want our kids to have access to art and music and sports teams, and that's understandable. However, we continue to say there will be opportunities without citing any of the actual opportunities. And so that discourages me a little bit. At the same time, being someone who fills in on the bus sometimes, there's a route from here to Floodbrook. That's 36 minutes if there's no traffic. That's no stops at all. So when we're talking about which kids we want to put on the bus, how long we want the rides to be, I think it's really important to keep in mind that right now we don't have anyone driving the bus. And we're talking about 30 years of spending. We're talking about bonding. Right? Transportation cost is not going to go down there like that. It's excellent that we can move into electric buses down here in the valley. We cannot run an electric bus on the routes that I've driven up the mountain, and that cost is not going down anytime soon. So I guess my number one thing would be, I want to say how grateful I am to you guys as a school board, and that I love that we're talking about cost, but I want to know how are we going to define metrics on what the opportunities are for kids and how we're measuring their success as they move out of middle school and into high school as a district that doesn't offer high school.
Is that a me question?
I think it's a question for all of us to think about. And I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot. I just want to shift the conversation as we're thinking about the economics of it to the actual people being served, the families and the students.
I guess I'll just mention that for the past 2-3 years now, when we've been discussing the middle school, we've held a number of committee forums. We've had multiple middle school study committees. Within those committees, there's been reports that we have published on our website that identify exactly that. What we think the increased opportunity is for our students by bringing them together. And it's everything from opportunities regarding extracurriculars to just equity of options within the school and access to programming, right? Whether all kids have access to algebra, for instance. So that's there, it's been considered. I would encourage you to take a look at it, and if there are things that we really missed, we would love to hear your feedback on that. But I think it's safe to say as a group we feel pretty confident that what we're seeing within our system right now is it's not equitable for all of our students. And that's kind of been our, I would say that that's been one of our priorities looking at this. Considering time, I know our board wants to talk about this and discuss this and try to get a recommendation to Randy. If I would consider taking 1 or 2 direct questions if they are related specifically to the slideshow presentation you've seen, and then I'll ask that you would keep your comments and hold them to the public comment after we've had a chance to discuss, if it's not directly related. I'll sit down here.
David Poindexter in Dorset. Just curious that the GED options, the Mountain School, Valley School, Regional Middle School, weren't considered for financial evaluation. They're only options that didn't require any kind of significant CapEx for expansion or new build. So the question is, what happens if the bond is rejected and we get to go back to square one? Should we not have some kind of contingency or possibly reevaluate those options, which are maybe a step in that direction and gives us a little bit of optionality in the future to figure out what happens at the macro level?
So that ultimately would fall to the board. It's likely that, whatever is proposed to the voters for the bond, it may be that I don't know the timing of how everything will fall out. There may be only one shot at the bond before things change, depending on the timing of whatever goes forward. And I think that there's still more work to do. There's still stages to this discussion. So the board will be seeking input on bond, more concept, like the building configurations, rendering, concept development that starts getting some feet. So I think we're far away from that, but I personally am not sure how many opportunities we'll get, which is part of why I'm continuing to move this forward.
David?
Yep.
And I'm going to save this comment for our discussion, but I think it's relevant. I'm concerned that we won't have any chance to have a bond vote, and I'm going to advocate that we think about a monster option, like a low cost, a low bond or no bond option within that. I'm having a hard time imagining that even if we have cost outlooks that are promising, that the state of Vermont the legislature is going to feel confident about giving each district the last-ditch opportunity to pass a bond and before their arranged marriages. Now, we don't have to bring dowry into this, wherever this arranged marriage is. I think like our reserve funds, our building and grounds, our tax stabilization funds, those I imagine, like with Act 46, we can use this as we want before consolidation, I would hope. But the current legislation that the governor put forward has it that all debt is assumed by the greater district. I can't imagine, I'm not political forecasting, but I can't imagine that's going to stand. There's so much of a hazard that there'll be a domino effect of everyone trying to jam through bonds. And maybe I'm completely wrong. I also feel personally uncomfortable with the idea of whoever is arranged marriages with, that we're telling fellow Vermonters that, we're bringing more debt into this marriage. So I'm going to say this for discussion, but I advocate for a low bond or non-bond option within group.
I think at this point, we are well over our time, I think, both with ours and the public. And I'd like to bring this back for the board to discuss. And if we see what kind of progress we can make. Questions and comments from our board regarding the options? Lizzie.
The first thing I'm going to say is, and then said this is Randy, I'm a scaredy cat when it comes to driving in bad weather. And so our board meeting being at Floodbrook really made me nervous. The idea that little kids would be on a bus, bus drivers and stuff like that. I am really against So in my head, having little kids go from Floodbrook down to here, bad weather, freaks me out. But also, and this is gonna be my bias here, but Courier is one of the schools that has the least amount that needs to be, from that infrastructure thing. We're one of the highest poverty, and it seems like by closing it, you're creating more inequities for those families, because there's a lot of families that don't have, even with bus routes, are still not making it to school. So I think there's more options that have been told, there's more options here that have been talked about, and then I feel like there's more options than there should be before. I don't know if I can make a decision, and even tonight there's more options. You know, like the gentleman said about maybe this the middle school and having another elementary school somewhere else. But I just want to make my opinion on that. I don't think I'm ready to make a decision, just because every time we have these conversations, more options are coming that I don't feel are getting discussed.
David.
I've been thinking that I'm a process guy, and for us to be able to make any kind of progress, we need to be very clear on how we're going to move forward. It seems to me that we look through this proposal, and the first thing we have to do is, do we agree that all the facts about the school sizes and the school capacities are accurate? I assume we would. But then the next one is, do we agree that all the criteria that they give will lead us to a durable solution? So for instance, do we, and this is where I'm hearing some questions, do we agree that the travel time goal of 45 to 60 minutes max is okay? I'm not so sure. Do we agree that equitable access to similar types of programs is important? Seems like that's a big deal, but that's what we should be judging these options by. Do we agree about a centralized preschool, that's important? Do we agree about the elementary school, that minimum of 2 sections per grade and grade alignment across all schools? And finally, do we agree that we want a regional middle school? And do we agree on alternative therapeutic programs? If we agree on all these things, it seems to me that those, unless we've left out something, those are the ways that we can drive ourselves towards identifying the best option, and then later on we can work out the details. But it means that we've got the main pieces in place, and that should hold us, that should be a firm foundation for moving forward over the next 30 to 50 years. That's the way I'm looking at this.
I saw Kelsey, you had your hand up before.
I guess I had like 2 more questions. One is if we moved forward with, not saying we would, but if we move forward with the recommendation today, and we looked at the effects of traffic within Manchester, if everything was in Manchester, as it was already discussed, it's already a little crazy pickup and drop-off times here. And then my other question is, I know we talked a little bit about this on Saturday, the timing, and that you would talk about this more in the April meeting, so maybe we don't want to get into it, but I'm just trying to understand, like, is it crucial that we have to come up with, like, a decision to move forward today, or could we, like, bump it down a little bit, you know, like, with the state not knowing, they're still working this all out, you know, is it essentially, I'm just trying to, I don't know how long all this takes. I'm trying to figure out the timing of it. I know you said you'll talk about this at April, but I guess, you know, can we explore the options more?
So you're looking at me like it's a question for me. The board asked me in November for a recommendation. In December, I said I would come to you with a recommendation between February and April. Yep. It's now March 17th. And you're having some recommendations. So,
the board, like,
so you know, this can continue. The board can continue to take, you know, you can take as much time as you want. I'll continue to share my concerns educationally. You know, if we, you know, you might hear more about it at budget if you haven't done anything next year, right? Like, you can take as much time, but we have to all, you know, consider the context. I'll continue to make my recommendations to the board around where I think we should go as a system right now, and you ultimately decide what and when you're going to bring something forward to the community. So it's not really my decision as much as your process and your timing moving forward. I'll give you answers to whatever questions you have. I'll get information for you. The feedback that I've received from a number of folks is that it's tough living in this space of uncertainty. I won't recommend that we keep schools open, that I won't do this, and that's probably my bias, but I won't recommend that we keep schools open that there's every indicator we'll have to consolidate at some point. Because for me, and this is for you as a board to consider, I have a hard time with the idea that I don't know what will happen to Sunderland, what somebody might decide to do with the students from that community, or Courier. We lose, I think there's no indication Taconic and Green continues to exist after a certain point, which means the longer we wait, and that's what I said, ultimately it is our decision, your decision as a board, the decision of the community about what we want to do, but from my lens, I will continue to move this forward because I feel like that this is our opportunity as a community. And I can keep saying it. I don't see myself changing that perspective.
Just a thought on, you want to share?
Your question about traffic, so we are considering that, and we would actually hire, if any options were to be explored in the next step that included this facility or others, we would have a traffic consultant as part of that next level of evaluation come down here, do the counts, do the actual the traffic engineering to make recommendations and have that deeper understanding. Part of what happens is, like, design is an iterative process, and you're essentially, it happens in stages, and you're almost like, to use the airplane metaphor, you know you're going in a direction, but you're not quite sure where the airport is. Then you find the airport. Then you start approaching the airport. We're still in the finding the airport stage. And if you say, well, we're looking at these 3 airports, now we have to go do a little more detailed look at each one of them and understand, do they actually work? And that's part of that next step. And it's really just about not spending, because you could do the full Monty on 50 different options, but the consulting costs are just outrageous. And we don't advise that because we think it's probably not an efficient use of taxpayer funds.
Right. And we're looking at roadways and what's the process if we want to close a road or reconfigure. I've talked to the town about properties and property to explore, but I'm not moving forward with anything until there's a reason to, if that makes sense.
So Ben, John, and Herb, I see you have your hands up. Are any of you looking to comment on the timeline specifically that Kelsey is? No, it's fine. Asking about where separate questions entirely. Oh,
I was too.
okay. No, that's fine. Let's just go around the table then, and Herb, and then John, and then Ben.
I entirely agree with David. I think he's raised a really important process point, and I don't think we should be making choices among the different alternatives until we have taken a position on whether the criteria, the planning criteria that we see in the options are 100% of what we actually endorse.
John?
Yeah, same as Herb, and I suggest that we even try to maybe even fine-tune those criteria even more. For example, personally, I think that that thing of the travel time, I think that we got to keep a school, elementary school open up on the mountain. Like for me, that's the suggested criteria that, you know, whether it's K through 5 or K through 6, and considering maybe we might have some wind hall students coming if legislation is passed. So that's an example. I'm not saying we have to discuss that, but that's an example of how we could fine tune this criteria to get closer to common, you know, sort of nail down on things. But personally, I think we've got to keep an elementary school open on the mountain.
Ben?
Just a couple comments. I think one is that I think this is a reminder for all of us to try to keep operating from a position of strength and opportunity versus fear and reaction. And there's a lot going on at the federal and state level that's going to have impact, is having impacts on us already. It's going to have a lot of impacts on us in the future, but we have to say for our kids and our communities have to keep trying to orient towards, despite all of what's going on, or even with all this going on, how can we find the opportunities at the moment? And I do think there are opportunities in renovating and refurbishing and adding new opportunities for in our schools for our kids. So whatever that looks like, I think that's an opportunity to keep orienting in that direction. But you can't lose sight of the reality of where we are and the distances in our districts. I think I know I'm biased. I live on the mountain, and I've had my partner works in Manchester. I've sent kids down to Manchester for school, for high school. It's like the realities are it's real, and it took me driving here tonight. It took me 40 minutes because of the roads, and I live 5 minutes from Loveland. So it's just not so unless someone come to my house, it's really that stuff. So the transportation does need to get fine-tuned. It is more complex than we're looking. But I think for me, I have been a big proponent of small schools. I've worked in education for a lot of years. I really believe in the relationship between teachers really deeply knowing students in small sizes and opportunities that are in that. But I think the biggest equity issues are really outside of our control. It just costs so much more to educate children now than it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Their costs are totally out of our control, and they're going up at rates that are going to keep going up, and we can't sustain it. The number of new required services that we have to provide in schools, it's just very different than it was 10 years ago. And there's, anyway, what we know now about how to educate students well is vastly different than it was 20 years ago. And all those things just mean it's more expensive to educate individual students and teaching their staff, and the economies of scale become that much more important. So keeping small schools open is just so much more expensive than it was. And unless we have a radical change in our economy, we're not going to be able to afford to keep those small schools open. So I'm saying all that because I'm really struggling with the idea of closing our small schools and the impact that has on our most vulnerable students and communities. But I just don't think it's economically viable anymore. And I think that even without the state pushing us, which I think it is, we're facing it. So I just, anyway, I'm sorry to go on too long, but I do think my push right now, or my preference right now is to lean towards at least having one of the two B options to keep Clubrook definitely in our final selection. That's important for our district.
Thank you,
Yeah, I mean, I think of the two B options, I think logistically, creating building in the middle school is going to be better for our students. It will cost more, so that's a complicated, but I think that's something that I think either of the options, Clubrook open, I think is really important.
I just want to check online, unless you want to speak directly to what he was saying.
Well, I'm a little bit concerned that any new building that we build is going to be, first the bond has to pass, but more in particular, we have to build the building, and that's at least, in my humble opinion, minimum of 2 or 3 years. I'm particularly concerned about the transition in those 3 years. And I think some of that should be worked out as we deal with the options. Secondly, I am very much aware of how long it takes from Weston and Londonderry to get to Floodbrook, and how long, when you pass Floodbrook, it takes to get to Manchester. And it's from Weston, you can't get to Floodbrook from Weston and many parts of Londonderry to Floodbrook in under 15 minutes. So we're going to have to run huge numbers of buses to make the routes more direct if we're going to do transportation. That's a logistical issue that needs to be solved. I personally want to educate as best as we can our students. And clearly, H and H1 offer, based on the criteria, once we accept the criteria, probably the highest level of pass. So at least one of the H's need to be considered. The second thing that I think is important is that the B issues are important, and it does keep Floodbrook in the mix. And then I think that John's suggestion of having a much lower cost option is useful. And so if we're asking to get down to 3, we need to first agree with the process outlined, and then my personal feeling, because I think that the process questions are easily answered and agreed to, I would say John's option of a lower cost non-bond issue, and then one of the B's, or 2 of the B's and 1 of the H's would be my personal preference to get to a resolution. And then that has to play out with the next phase, which is the logistics. And I think coming down from the mountain is going to be a logistic that is going to be really hard to satisfy. And therefore, it may fall on its own.
Celeste, somebody's online. Jeff, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mel. I guess if we're going around the room, I guess I'll put my 2 cents as well. And I guess I'm on the same page as many of the others, but I like the category 3 options. Both those options, I guess there's 4 of them there, they're outlined, have been recommended by both the executive committee as well as our facility committee. I think the rationale is well articulated. I think if we're really thinking about long-term stability and progress in this school district, those are the things we should be looking at. I understand the sacrifice that some people may think they have to encounter associated with that, change is possible, but I think the handwriting is on the wall when it comes to what the state is going to do at some point, maybe not this year, but next year. I think we better be best if we well position ourselves to do something along these lines so that we have a plan in the pocket as opposed to one that will be dictated to us. So I would opt for that, and I would opt for moving forward with that with further analysis by our consultants and by our administrators.
Thank you, Jeff. Did you have your hand up also, John, and then Herb?
Okay. I'm going to raise that question again. The criteria. Do we think that elementary, should we have elementary is stay on mountain, right? If we can kind of agree on that criteria, that's going to get us, will help us move the needle forward. I was curious what the board thinks. That is something that we all agree, most of us agree that, that should be part of the criteria.
Go ahead, Herb.
And following up on that, I don't know whether tonight we know enough about the transportation times from, let's say, the northern part of Weston to here, so that we can figure out whether what's being proposed is really reasonable. But there are other things about the criteria. I don't think we should necessarily assume that the board is unanimous that all the planning criteria are actually what we want, and then some of them are vague enough, so I think they need more definition.
Could I maybe suggest, Randy, I feel like, and this is a question I think for you folks also, this criteria was set, maybe could you remind us where this criteria came from? I feel like it was a process, and maybe it's helpful to know where it came from so we know, we can think about how it is we might want to readdress it.
So there was a questionnaire that was provided to guide sort of the big picture of decision making. So all of this information came with input from principals and central office leaders around sort of best practices, things we're doing, experiences leading buildings, and how to most kind of the parameters by which we can most effectively educate kids. So then the architects took all the results from those questionnaires and then compiled this. So it's generated by our admin team.
So this is not, I feel like we've voted it before on some of the criteria in the past. Maybe like 2 years ago when we first opened up this project. Is that
so
not
also
this?
part of it, Cam, right, it came from the elementary visioning work?
Yep.
The combination of the elementary visioning and the questionnaires, am I right about that?
That's correct.
Okay, so there were like 30 or 35 folks, I forgot about that all worked together. So we had parents, teachers, administrators going through the visioning process. That information was collected, then administrators also completed these questionnaires. They pulled all of that together to come up with these guiding principles.
It's a synthesis of a lot of conversations and questionnaires that were filled out by school staff. I'll offer that there's an incredible consistency, and maybe it's because we're always talking to educators, but there's been an incredible consistency. We're working with a district in the Northeast Kingdom on a very similar project, almost the same exact issues. They also need a regional middle school. We're working with a district in central Vermont who's considering these same questions. And there's a remarkable alignment across educators in different parts of the state around what the planning criteria are if your focus is on creating the maximum number of opportunities for students. And I think that's the lens that these were developed with. So I'm just offering that as an observation.
Oh, go ahead, Lindsay.
Just one more comment. I know you said you talked transportation, and that's where like the 45 minute to 60-minute goal came from, and that these all sort of put some past that. But I live 8 miles from school. My kids are on the bus an hour. So how, with them going from Courier to Manchester or Manchester home, be less time than what it takes now for my kids to go 8 miles home?
So I can let Derek talk about it, but part of what will happen through this process is consolidation and efficiency of routes. So right now, we're not operating for transportation as efficiently as we could be because of the nature of how we're organized. But we gain efficiency through consolidation. So that's part of that. We've been talking about transportation almost since the beginning. And I completely understand that the board may want more details associated with that. We can get you that. I don't know, Derek, if you want to comment any more on any of that right now.
Yeah, right now.
Derek's our director of transportation.
We double up a lot of runs from the online stores that have to now right now. So we're getting online, we're taking online stores, we're transferring vehicles to another bus, either stay at school and wait for the school doors to open. If I need to get a lot of moving parts. So it would, I'm not saying it wouldn't have to add drivers, but we think it would be a more direct route. 2 buses per day, like we were saying. One does one side of town, one does the other side of town, right down.
But like I'm saying, even now on one of the buses, just in Dandy, it's an hour.
In the afternoon.
I'm not sure morning, because my kids are asleep at first.
And one bus going the whole town from
Oh, okay.
yeah, but I have one bus.
Yeah, so,
That's like the stuff that I think would need to be.
well, if you want details, you can give us interaction, we can provide you with more details.
Yeah, if I may, just for a second, this is another thing that there's been tremendous, Vermonters up and down the state are very consistent about this. And everybody we talk to, and I'm a parent, I've got 2 kids on the bus as well, going to a regional elementary school and regional high school. And it's true in every part of Vermont. I think because the last really big reorganization that happened across the whole state was in the 60s when we had the creation of supervisory unions, and the state kind of got chunked up into these 1-hour chunks. And it's because that reorganization was based on buses being available. It was the post-war boom, the rise of the automotive era. People have cars, we have kids on buses now. We're closing one-room schoolhouses, we're building these central schools, we're building these regional high schools in the more rural parts of the state. And we've already reorganized into the districts that have that kind of 1-hour-ish limit. But across the state, what people say is, we really don't want our kids on the bus for more than 45 minutes. But in every single district that we work in, when we hear from the administrative teams, there's already buses that are out there for more than an hour. And there's a disconnect between what people want and what the geography of Vermont and the current organization allows for. So that disconnect I'm just saying this is not unique. And the thing is, I don't know that we don't have like a new infrastructure for moving humans since then. It's still automobiles and buses. So, I don't know that there's a great way to address that other than having more detailed looks at, well, you have to game it out. If you're going to have a school in this community, and this community, and this community, and it serves this region, where do all the people live, and where would the buses go? And in a sense, you'd say what it is you want to have, and then you do your best job. Like you said, we want it to be less than an hour. Well, that says you've got to have X number of buses. If people could live with 90 minutes, maybe the busing costs go down. But I don't think nobody wants that. But you see what I'm saying. You have to kind of game it out. And again, I think we could game it out for 15 or 50 scenarios. But it takes more time and it takes more resources. So it's trying to balance out and also know that you can shift a little bit, right? Like the gentleman who suggested a new elementary school instead of a new middle school. Well, I think those explorations a little bit go hand in hand. I'm not saying that one is equal to the other, but you learn things about the exploration by doing it. And maybe you learn that it's more advantageous to shift and do this other thing. So there's a little bit that you can continue to learn as you move forward, and that's the nature of design and planning.
So I'd like to ask the board, I think there's 2 questions here I have for us. One, do we think we can eliminate one, if not 2 of the options, B, B1, H, and H1? And 2, there's been a lot of discussion about the criteria. I wonder if, rather than spend the time specifically on the criteria now, we narrow our focus so that the superintendent and Truex Collins can move forward. And in the meantime, and maybe for our next meeting, we consider during that time how we might want to shift the criteria and then apply, or when we look at the new information coming through, we allow both the lens of the criteria that is set now and a new set of criteria, or maybe a more narrowed focus, which might also help us make that decision once it comes down to it. I guess a straw poll from the board. So rather than reset the criteria right now, which feels like a lengthy discussion, I think there's some good, we all know that there's good things within the criteria, but maybe there's some shifting that we want to do. And I would imagine nobody wants to reinvent the wheel right now. Yes? Okay, great. So if we can at least eliminate one of the options, assuming that we agree that the 4 options, B, B1, H, and H1, are the most viable. If we can narrow it down to 3, we can then make a recommendation to Randy, who will again work with Truex Collins, to find out, you know, what kind of information. That recommendation I'm going to look for you to make. And then at our next meeting, whether it be at our meeting in April or the next time we talk about this, we can come with a fresh perspective to criteria and consider refining the criteria. Maybe that's how we address the information that comes from the recommendation. Still not clear? It's okay if it's not.
I'd like to define it even more.
Great.
I think if we listen to what's been going on, if we just say B and not say B1 or B, just
Okay.
say a B concept, which includes Floodbrook, would be one option that we explore. An H concept, which could be K through 4 or K through 5, but not decide that yet, just an H concept. And then, as Dick said, and these are all what Dick said in the beginning of the discussion, is there any way to find a lower cost or non-bond approach? And so that would be my third one. So I would propose a B and H and a low cost, non-bond approach.
Second.
Second.
So I'll say right now, I'm not exactly sure what goes into a no bond.
Right.
Because one of the things that we've done is everything has the same, we're spreading the butters cleanly over the bread the same. And so we're taking into account things like the deferred maintenance. We're trying to take into account any construction that would be needed, because there's at least a couple options that I don't think made it to the end that would have required additions to elementary schools. So I'm not sure what you take out. I think, I'm just, you know, you can say, well, we're just not going to do, we're going to do 50% of the deferred maintenance. You know, you can say that. And whether that is realistic or not, I don't know. I can't see the future. But I think when you do that, it doesn't change the relationship of the options to each other. Like they scale up and scale down. You know what I mean?
Ben, do you want to add to that?
I think the one thing that we're not talking about is time, right? That's where we can play with this. It's like the other way I see this is a low cost. We have a short-term low cost option, which is to do nothing. Because if we go for 3 years and just pay deferred maintenance for 3 years, it's not going to cost us that full extent. And then we get merged, and then the cost of whatever happens is borne by a much larger district. So that actually financially may be the cheapest option for our taxpayers of all. I don't know that that's the best option educationally for our students, because it doesn't address the issues that we've been talking about for a number of years already about providing services to our kids in class sizes that are too small and not providing equitable middle school options. But if we were to say we're just going to, we know that if we get merged, if this, whatever the state plan is, we get merged into a larger district, and there's minimum class sizes, minimum school sizes, we know our districts are going to get blown up. We know our schools are going to get consolidated. It's just that we won't have any choice. We won't get to dictate how that happens, and we also won't pay for it in the same way that we will now.
Right. I do want to add to that too, and Lindsay kind of sympathize with me in this respect. That also means not doing anything, means that Sunderland risks being redistricted to Arlington.
Absolutely.
And Courier risks being redistricted north. Which is, right, it's cheaper, but the other risks are there and important. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, to Cam about the no bond. My point from there too is I'm just concerned we're not, the legislature is going to say, no one's doing any bonds on school construction aid. It's going to create a disaster. So that's why I think that we need to consider that. I think A1 should be elevated as a consideration, maybe with pre-K being a Dorset pre-K and Fluff Mountain and the Valley pre-K. I think A1 potentially be lower cost and could potentially be feasible. But I don't know. But I'm curious a little more about that option. And I think it's deserves more consideration.
John, can I ask you a question though? You say the legislature won't allow us to. Is there anything you've read or that was indicating that? Because I haven't heard that discussed at all. So.
Nothing I've read. There's concerns about that, but
I think the legislation proposed now would have the costs shared by everybody in the district.
Right.
And I actually don't know that mechanically there's another way for them to do it.
That's right.
Because the way that the taxes would be calculated in the new district would be based on the new district, not based on your old paradigms from before the new district. You know what I mean? It's the same thing that happened, I think, with the same thing happened with Act 46, I believe.
I know, but are they going to let districts right up before, if you know you're going to be able to merge with another district, are you going to let districts do $80 million bonds?
I don't think right now they have a mechanism to stop you.
Yeah, that's what they want.
I know, that's what I'm saying.
We're
that's
going
what I'm
through this
saying
with
I'm
another
concerned
school,
about,
too.
and that's why keeping this in our back pocket, that's the whole logic behind it, just keeping that in our back pocket.
Yeah, we'll know a lot more towards the end of this session. You know, another month or two, and whatever legislation has a chance of progressing will have emerged.
Herb.
Just on John's suggestion of A1, that's an example of why we have to look carefully at the planning criteria, because the only thing that A1 fails, as I see it here, is minimum 2 sections per grade, minimum. Well, I don't know enough about balancing having to have 2 sections per grade against some of the transportation criteria, for example, to be able to say which is better. I'm open to the idea that, yeah, okay, so we don't have 2 sections per grade, but are there benefits that would come from A1 that don't come from the other ones?
So there, would you accept, David, the A1, or do you want to just call it A?
A1.
A1.
Are you hoping to make a motion right now?
Well,
Yes.
we
Okay,
we
can I
did.
just be clear? I just want to make sure that we're clear that David's making a motion. Would you just restate it again, please?
So I propose that we explore option B as a general option because it includes Floodbrook. Option 8 because it has 2 centralized schools in Manchester. And then option A1 as an alternative that is almost as good as the other two, and actually might be our transition vehicle.
Maybe.
I think I'll just for the benefit of the board and people still in attendance, you guys all have days of patience, that we really, for our purposes, we really do need you to nail down B or B1, because looking at that, because the next stage involves drawing a plan, and it has to have all the rooms, and it's really 2 plans if you have 2 different options. You know what I mean?
David, what did you just say? I'm sorry, what did you say before?
Well, I just said B because it includes Floodbrook, and I wasn't going to choose the grades, this B1. That's what we should do.
It would be better for us to have direction to
All right.
look at one or the other.
Just B1.
And it could be
B1,
adaptable
H1.
at a later point in time.
B1, H1, and A1. Sounds like chemistry formula.
I seconded it.
Well, the 2 H's though, we're talking about, the 6 to 8 versus 5 to 8.
Right.
So those are probably close enough that that's not going to be.
Well, the middle school is going to be different, I think.
Right.
So I think it is,
You're
I
right,
think the
you're
difference
right, you're
between H and H1 is two different designs for the
But
middle
I'm
school.
just
It's really
guessing
two
on that,
options.
that we need to, I think, that we really need to think of educational.
So you want 4 options? B1, H1, H2?
We just haven't discussed, for a long time, middle school being 5 to 8.
We can certainly look at more, there's no golden rule that we have to do 3. I mean, it's a function of how much time and expense to go through the planning. It's not huge. I don't want to make it a big deal. If the board feels there's very high value in having that 4th option, then it's probably worth it.
I think, looking at the B1 is a really good choice. I think, the A1 as an alternative is, A1 is closer to, it's much more minimal change with no building.
So,
And H1 and H both have a lot of the same things. The middle school obviously is
Right.
different, but the transportation and a lot of the centralization is
To
same.
make a decision between H and H1,
The-
we need more board discussion and input from the
that,
superintendent.
except the architects did say that of the H's, the one that comes closest to dispersing students is H1. So that, if H1 fails on transportation issues as an obstacle that's impossible to overcome, and other issues associated with some of the criteria, then H's don't work. In addition, both H's require purchase of land, and H's could consider, instead of a middle school, focus more on an elementary school, which frankly probably never got in as a possibility. But that would certainly be something that was mentioned. It hasn't been really explored at this point. So I think David's motion, which I seconded, really is B1, H1, and A1, which gives us the greatest flexibility and feasibility. And it narrows it to the 3 that we said, and it also includes another criteria, because B1 and A1 do not eliminate floodbrook, thereby creating a potential solution to the transportation issue, which I personally think, given how it goes. So that's why I would argue that that would be our choice to go forward.
Does it make sense to even put H1 in the motion, or to have all from the motion to do all 3 together?
As we were just
I
told,
think, right, the motion right now as it stands will be to consider B1, H1, and A1.
as the ones to be developed.
As the ones to be developed, thank you.
So I would just can I just interrupt for a second? When you say developed, some of this needs to be cost modeled, and I think that we can, and we should, my office and the architects should come to you with cost modeling and staffing proposals that are aligned with the enrollment numbers that are, because I think that you're looking at a bunch of part-time staff, and I think it's important that you understand as you're looking at some of the staffing, that if you're having smaller schools, you won't have some full-time folks. And so I think I want to make sure you can make the most informed decision and understand some of the factors that we've been operating with to build stability and build community and avoid itinerant folks. We may, that may be compromised in some of the options you're considering. So I think the cost modeling and staffing is important, and we can give that to you, which you don't have for everything yet.
Do you think that we should be a little more specific in our motion?
Well, I just think, what is it that you're looking for developed and in what time frame? just so that we're on the same page and the public's on the same page. You've got a meeting in 2 weeks. I'm not sure what we can accomplish in the next 2 weeks to move this forward, but we could probably do some of it. I just would like to make sure that we're clear on what it is you want from us when we've done what you asked.
Well,
Lindsay.
Whatever David's motion, the A, B, H, whatever one, do we have to, if we say yes, we want to look into these, does our eventual outcome decision have to be one of those? Because to be honest, I'm not 100% sure I like any of them, but I don't want to be stuck with having to make a decision on only those three because I approve.
It explores
So that's why
feasibility.
I just want to know, if we say yes, we want to look into these, if the outcome has to be one of those three, or can we get something eventually, a different option?
Herb, you want to? Yeah. Do you want to address that, Herb?
Well, it seems to me that theoretically, anyway, you could pass the motion, and then the board looks at it in April or May and says, no, we really don't want to go that way, and then you're back to where Lindsay suggests. I don't think it's very likely, but it could happen.
My concern is if some of us agree with John about keeping an elementary school on the mountain, does it make sense to look at H1 because that would close it?
It's cost.
Or you just check that?
Yeah.
It's a cost.
Can I, is there somebody have a hand raised?
Yeah.
Do you know who? Is it public?
Is it just LGA? It's
Huh.
not now.
Okay. I think in an effort to move forward, I mean, I feel like we have enough here that we could at least vote on this. And if it goes down, we can kind of readdress it.
Do we want to readdress the criteria then? It sounded like the place to get the, does Floodbrook have to stay open because they're not willing to do transportation? That would be criteria versus,
Right.
that would be one of the fundamental criteria.
It may also be,
We could discuss.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
go,
interrupt you.
please.
Well, it may be advantageous, so I say this all the time, and it sounds like I'm being trite, glib, but architecture is a process of discovery. Planning and architecture is really a process of discovery. We don't know, if we knew what to do without going through the process, we would just do it. And so part of it, maybe the value of going through the exploration of an option H, for instance, is to show this doesn't work. And then you can put it to bed and you have more knowledge than you do now, because now we're suspecting that for a number of reasons this isn't going to make sense. And so going through the process of gaming it out is the way that you say, yeah, it's really not going to work. And that's part of the risk, but also the magic of doing the process, because I'm thinking that if you explore these three options, you're going to find that one of them does kind of bubble up, or maybe two of them are good and one of them is not. They are not all going to be co-equal when you look at both the next level of, well, geez, we really don't even know, or this building is going to take 5 additions. It's going to be really complicated. That's going to be a nightmare of a project. Or this one's really clean. There's a place to put the addition. It works really nicely. There's a lot we're going to learn about it through this next stage. So keeping an option H on the table to sort of game it out and prove or disprove is helpful in that respect.
David, do you have a motion on the table? Randy also recommended that she would like some guidance on what it is that we're asking for, cost modeling, staffing, timeline. Do you want to amend your motion to include those things, or do we want to address them separately?
That's a good question. I guess I was thinking that there was an idea when we were talking about picking an option and exploring it, that you all had an idea of what that included. But if you don't, then I would add what Randy wanted to have added, what you suggested, costs.
Cost modeling, staffing,
Right.
we'd have to address timeline.
Right. Because Dick has raised the issue of transition as well.
And from our end, the next exploration involves building plans and site plans, as well as a few other due diligence pieces, looking at wetland mapping. In the case of options that include a new site, doing some work on site selection, because you can't design a building that doesn't have a site. So there's a number of those things that are included in that next exploration. A lot of the site selection stuff is kind of going back to where we were as a middle school group. That work that was kind of put on hiatus back in August.
Do we need to complete these though? Can we just choose the models and then we need to.
Well, that's what I'm asking David, if he wants to amend his motion, thank you.
Suggestion,
Mm-hmm.
one of the most important elements, which is contracted out anyway, is the transportation. So I think that, if we're looking at a set of options right now, starting the transportation study would probably make sense to begin as soon as possible.
A1 was rejected because it really did segment and create more partial employees. But I think it's an important thing to explore so that we flesh out what the real implications of A1 is. The recommendation of both the facilities and the executive group were Bs. And when I arrived here tonight, I thought pretty much the Bs had much the same kind of plan and option. The H's were pretty much the same. But we got a recommendation that there's an architectural difference between B1 and H1. So I looked and remembered the statement, I don't know which of the two of you, said the H1 fulfills the proper size that accords with the mandate, which is why that 5th grade was added in the buildings. And so I'd like to see that model because it protects us over the longest period of time. And it also gives us a little bit more time to really take a look at the educational advantages of a 5th grade being added. So I think that the criteria that you mentioned, we're throwing back A1 at you, and we got to figure out what are the real downsides of A1 that was rejected. And when you get to A1 as an option, I believe it says that it only passed was the 2 sections, was the only issue that it failed on. And we recognize that that does create, so it is a rejected thing by the criteria, but it seems to answer a large number of other concerns. And so therefore, modeling that out, but finding out the negatives in greater detail would help us understand why it may have to be eliminated.
Dick, I want to, Jessica's online. We haven't heard from Jessica, so let's go ahead and get that question in.
I'm happy to make a motion anytime.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead and make the motion now?
To adjust the motion so that it says to explore the viabilities of B1, H1, and A1, and include all the total cost options in that comparison. See if one bubbles up.
And reasons for it in terms of facility, feasibility is the, not facility.
Randy, is that clear enough to give you guidance to move forward?
Sure. And if I get it wrong,
you'll tell me in April.
Great. And Dick, you're seconding that
Yeah,
still
I-
as amended? Okay. Jessica,
Does it include the transportation thing?
Yes.
I couldn't hear what Jim said. Is that part of it?
Yes.
yes.
Okay, great.
How do we, yes.
I
Randy.
just want to, I think that Lindsay's question we didn't answer, and I think it's actually really important, so I want to respond to it. This is how I would see the answer to your question. Others may disagree. We explore these three models, A1, B1, H1. The board ultimately will discuss those. Somebody at some point will make a motion to proceed with X. The board will then vote on that, right? It is possible that the very first proposal is voted on and approved by the board to move forward. It's possible that all three of them get rejected, not voted by the board. So, and I think at any point during the process, if there is something that should be considered, the board at any point can raise those, and you will vote to decide what moves forward and what doesn't.
So we're not bound by just these.
I don't
That's
see
correct.
a
I don't see
mechanism by which you would be bound to these. However, board process would determine what moves forward and what doesn't, and whether anything is added or not.
Absolutely.
Right? That's how I see the answer to your question, and I wanted to try to, because I could feel that from you, like that
I was still
angst.
sitting here not sure what I was,
Yeah.
what the answer
So-
was, but now I know better.
That's Randy's version of the answer, but I think that covered relatively.
Any last questions, comments? We're ready to vote. All those in favor of the motion to explore B1, H1, A1, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Do we have everybody on there, Celeste? No. Okay.
I know I see Jessica and Deb. Then what about
Jack?
Jack?
That's for some.
Not, yeah, is she?
Yeah.
Okay. Any opposed? Any abstentions? I think that's unanimous. Great, thank you. Public comment. We have, yeah. Yeah.
Just as a comment, I just want to acknowledge that we just, as a board, selected three options that have some real opportunities. But those are three options that help close a few of our schools. So I just want to acknowledge that as a board. Like,
Maybe three.
Yeah, and maybe three, or maybe four. But it's just sitting really heavy with me to like, I think, one thing is sort of try to pick and choose between what's in front of us when there's another reality that so there's nothing to do about it in this moment other than acknowledge it.
I agree.
It's a big change.
Yeah, and the status quo is always, that's always the fourth option. I think we can't forget that. That's always there. We always weigh everything against the status quo.
And we have cost modeling for that in our budgets every year. Public comment. Yeah.
My name is Chris, I'm from Londonderry. Couple things that I just say that I think would encourage the board to do. Eventually, whatever you do decide, we're going to have to vote it, and you have to choose something that is going to be moved to pass. The other thing I would say is, schools are important to their towns. You all know that, obviously. And I appreciate, as you said, it's a lot for four schools, 3 schools, 4 schools. So I think that was well acknowledged. And I would just encourage us to, as we go forward, think about, like, school is more than just numbers, it's more than just how much it costs. It's about communities, it's about people who come together in a community, and that is easier to do when you're closer to your school. I understand there's reasons to consolidate, but there are also reasons not to. And finally, the state, to some extent, I don't want us to make a bad decision because we think the state is forcing us into it. Like, just to say, well, the state's going to force us to do this, so we should just do it. Well, if they're going to force us to do something crap, let's just make them force us to do it. Hey, if they wanted us all to go to Rutland, okay, make us do it, right? We're not going to vote to do that just because we think it would be a better option. Well, at least we got to make a decision. Well, it's not a decision if we're making it because we think they're forcing us to make it. So, and if we disagree with their decision, we will vote against our legislature.
I just wanted to know or have you consider how many jobs are going to be lost in these consolidations and what that will do for the communities of an already aging state.
Did you guys hear? I mean, I guess the only thing that if that will come out cost in the modeling, and I know you guys have considered it, but I don't know if we'd be prepared to comment on that.
Yeah, it's really not very much. We've been right sizing and reducing positions over time. We spent a lot of time, that's actually an area that the architects were like, are you sure your numbers are right? Are you sure your numbers are right? Because most districts haven't been responding to declining enrollment the way that we have. That's part of why we're in the position we are, where we've reached that point of our enrollment is low enough that I'm really concerned about the impact on learning, which is what has generated all of this. So we're in a pretty good spot. I don't anticipate, depending on obviously where we land, whichever model it is, could impact that, but I don't expect significant reductions in positions.
Any last comments?
Mark Phillips, it seems like the subtext is we have to do something before the state does stuff for us. I'm just wondering, what do we think doing it first, like explicitly, what does that get us? Because it feels like that's kind of underneath all of this. I'm just wondering, explicitly, will this preempt them doing something to us or not? Obviously, we don't know for sure, but it feels like that's at the heart of everything.
Does anybody want to respond specifically? Oh, yes. If we are talking about doing this to get ahead of the state, what specifically or explicitly it is that I guess is it safe to say we're trying to avoid by getting ahead of it, or?
And we started these conversations long before anything came from the state. We're just now operating in a different context. If the state wasn't doing what they were doing, we'd be having these, but we'd be having the conversations. But some of the parameters that we know are looking to be legislated, I wouldn't be considering in my recommendations the way that we are right now. So it just adds another level of context versus, and then obviously potentially the timeline, right, that we've alluded to. But the work would still be happening in the recommendations to be a more efficient, stable system in order to stabilize our educational system. I'd still be making the same recommendations for us as a community talking about it.
Just to clarify, is there a benefit of doing this before they make their decision? Or is the clock ticking? Or why not just wait until after that? I'm genuinely curious. I don't know or understand.
The real thing we're trying to accomplish is we're trying to make a more intelligent decision than we are afraid the state may make if we leave it to them.
Well, I think it's also about who's the voting body. I mean, I've seen this in other school districts, particularly for Act 46, when there was consolidation of school districts into larger districts. That if this assemblage of communities wants to build like a new state-of-the-art middle school, do you want the voters in this communities for the kids that will be going to that school to make the decision, or do you want every voter from Rutland to Pownell to decide whether or not these 5 towns get a new state-of-the-art middle school?
Or do
the lines get split some other way that doesn't make sense now? Do you take this moment to control your destiny, or let it lie until someone else who may or may not share your values or considerations or your deep understanding of this assemblage of communities.
I think it's also important that if we, the superintendent's been pushing us for a while, recognize the fact that we are not doing school as well as you could be. And so try to move in the direction of, improving the system. And what actually would be likely at the state level, if we don't make a decision and move our system in the direction of trying to improve it, actually most likely what will happen at the state level is they will never allow us to do anything.
What I would like to throw in there is I've been very active in this discussion, usually I keep my mouth shut. But I think Randy's been very proactive and made us to be very proactive because we're recognizing that we are one ecosystem that stretches all the way from Weston to Dorset and Paulet and all the way from Sunderland to Danby. That's a big area. It's the largest geographic square mile area in the state for an SU. She's also recognizing that schools have to provide a very wide range of services. It's a lot different than it was 30, 40 years ago when we had the individual schoolhouses and we could cater things to individual kids. Now you've got all these requirements of all the different range of services, and so that takes us to why it's urgent now. It's recognizing that we need, that costs are increasing at such a fast rate that we need the economies of scale provided by minimum class sizes and by 2 sections per grade and centralized pre-K and even special ed. So I think recognizing all these things, this seems to be an important decision node that we should be working our way through. Whether it was guided by the state or not, I think it's really important that we're doing it now.
Leslie Perez on the next question.
Let's take 2 more comments, and Leslie, that'll be you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, at what point are you going to present what will this do to our tax rates? As I've said before, since joining Taconic and Green, Sunderland's tax rates have gone up exponentially. No one's talked about what will actually happen to the tax rates if we do all of these closures and building new buildings.
You want me to?
If you'd like to, Jim. Otherwise, I can.
One issue, we're not really going to understand the tax rates. That's another one of the issues that is up at the state. The entire formula for how education is paid for is probably going to significantly change. Also, Sunderland, we did actually set Sunderland. We had particular circumstances that led to have an extremely low tax rate on day one of
Lowest it could be.
the lowest it could be by law. But I think, the key thing, as we do all this modeling, we'll have an indication of how much we're spending and how much it would impact our annual budgets going forward. And the reason to bond out is to spread essentially the cost over 30 years, so it becomes may have less of an impact on our annual budget. But we're gonna it'll take us doing all that modeling to start to try to have an impact on how much of an impact.
And it's hard to know also because the proposal of switching to a foundation formula funding system is going to recalibrate everything, and I think that there's a strong likelihood that the entire way we fund educational change, so predicting anything in the future of tax rate is really at this moment, given what we know, not doesn't have a purpose because it doesn't inform anything because it's going to change so much.
And I understand that the state is making this extremely difficult and an inappropriate way to run a business. How can you think about spending tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, and without knowing what is that going to do to the taxpayer? And remember, my taxes before day one were thousands of dollars less than what they are now.
Leslie, I think.
So I think it's really important for us that who in the state is going to say, if we do something like this, what will it do to the taxes?
Leslie, I think the short and sweet answer is, by narrowing it down tonight, we have an opportunity to look at what those numbers will be. And that information will come to light as our modeling is put
And we
together.
ran some modeled bonds that are available on the website based
Yeah.
on last year's tax rate.
We're narrowing down to a few options, and you'll know before you vote
Right.
what the tax rate's gonna be. If you don't like it, vote against it.
Yeah. Herb, do you have a quick comment?
Yeah, also bear in mind that the do-nothing option, which gets more expensive every year, also affects the tax rate.
Well, last question for the public. Go ahead.
Just a comment, because we couldn't interject your discussion, I was a little bit, say concerned that you chose H1 over H, because H had the greatest savings, and just like the number after the letter, it sounded like it. Anyway, and the difference here is where you put the fifth graders, essentially. The MEMS or back at the other schools, but had the greatest savings, and to help you keep enough flexibility, that's possibly because we require less middle school H versus H1, which will probably affect the cost in the long run. So I'd like to encourage you to keep some flexibility on a variation that's focusing on those exact three models.
Thank you. I'm going to close public comment now. I think our last point of the agenda is to set the next meeting date. We have it for April 1st, 2025, 6:30 at the Dorset School. Any reason to change that? No, great. I feel like I had a question for you and I didn't write it down. Well, have to wait till the next meeting. Can I, before we get an adjournment, also I just want to say I appreciate this board having this conversation. Also being flexible with me letting it go completely over. I do also recognize the weight of this. I know we've lost a lot of public now, but I think it was at least valuable for them to get to spend as much time as they did to at least get the point across. So I'm sorry I ran such a late meeting. However, no regrets. So the last motion for the night.
I move we adjourn.
Second.
Anybody object?